November 1919, Prague. A man sits alone at a wooden desk. He is 36 years old, thin as a reed, with enormous dark eyes that seem to absorb more light than they reflect. For weeks now, he has been writing through the night while his parents sleep one floor below, unaware that their son is composing his most devastating work. Not a novel, not a story, something far more dangerous. 103 pages lie before him. He picks up the final sheet, reads the last sentence and sets down his pen. It is done. The letter begins simply enough. Dearest Father, you asked me recently why I maintain that I am afraid of you. What follows is unlike anything in the history of literature. 103 pages of accusation, 103 pages of pain accumulated over 3.5 decades. He describes how his father humiliated him at the dinner table, how he mocked his body, his choices, his dreams, how he destroyed his first attempt at love with a single cutting phrase, how he rendered him incapable not physically, but spiritually, of ever truly loving, marrying, or living a complete life. This is the most brutal document ever written about a parent by a child, a psychological explosion aimed at one man. Franz Kafka seals the envelope. He rises from his chair, legs stiff from hours of sitting. He walks to his mother's room. "Give this to Father," he says. Julie Kafka takes the envelope. She looks at her son, this strange, brilliant, tortured creature she brought into the world. She feels the weight of the pages within. She never delivers it. The letter will return to France. Hermann Kafka will never read a single word. The verdict will never be pronounced. Why did she betray her son? What did she read between those lines? And what happened in the Kafka household over 36 years to produce such concentrated fury? To understand this letter, we must travel back 4 decades to a poor village in southern Bohemia, where a boy was born who would become a monster in his own son's eyes. But here is something worth remembering. Monsters are not born, they are made. The village was called Wosek. In the winter of 1850, it was little more than a collection of wooden houses clustered around a muddy road. The Jewish families who lived there occupied the lowest rung of an already impoverished community. They were peddlers mostly, small traders who walked from village to village, selling buttons and thread and cheap cloth to peasants who had barely enough money to feed themselves. Into this world, Jakob Kafka and his wife Franziska brought their son Hermann. The year was 1852. There would be no childhood for this boy. By the age of 6, Hermann was working, not playing at work, not helping occasionally, but laboring. He pulled a cart loaded with goods through the surrounding villages, in winter, in summer, in rain and snow, often barefoot because shoes cost money the family did not have. The distances were considerable, 3 villages in a single day, sometimes 4, a child's legs carrying a man's burden. What does such a childhood do to a person? It teaches him that the world is harsh and unforgiving. It teaches him that survival requires hardness in return. It teaches him that sentiment is a luxury he cannot afford. And it plants a seed of rage at his circumstances, rage at his helplessness, fury that will need somewhere to go when he finally has power over others. At 18, Hermann escaped Wosek the only way a poor Jewish boy could, through military service. He joined the Austro-Hungarian army and served for years, absorbing its discipline, its hierarchy, its belief that authority must never be questioned. The army did not soften him. It completed his transformation from beaten child to hard man. When he left the service, Hermann headed for Prague. The city was a different world, cobblestone streets, grand buildings, the bustle of commerce and culture. Here, a man with enough determination could rise. Hermann had determination in abundance. What he lacked in education, he made up for in sheer, relentless will. He found work. He saved. He watched and learned how business was conducted. And in 1882, at the age of 30, he took the most important step of his life. He married Julie Lerwi. The Lerwis were different from the Kafkas. They were educated, cultured, with rabbis and scholars in their lineage. Julie brought not only respectability to the marriage, but something Hermann desperately needed: money. Her dowry allowed him to open a small shop selling fancy goods, umbrellas, buttons, ribbons, walking sticks. The shop bore his name. Hermann Kafka had arrived. The marriage was practical rather than passionate. Julie was quiet, hardworking, and accommodating. She would need to be. Her husband's temper, forged in the poverty of Wosek and the discipline of the army, erupted frequently. He shouted at employees. He shouted at suppliers. He shouted at his wife when she displeased him, which was often since almost everything displeased him. Yet the shop prospered. Herman expanded. He moved to larger premises in the center of Prague near the old town square. He hired employees and worked them hard. He was building something, a legacy, a fortress against the poverty that had nearly destroyed him. Nothing would threaten this fortress. Not competitors, not economic downturns, and certainly not the weakness he sensed in others, including, eventually, his own children. Before France, there were others. This is a fact that biographers sometimes mention only in passing, yet it shaped everything that followed. Julie Kafka had given birth to 2 sons before Franz, Georg and Heinrich. Both died in infancy within 2 years of their birth, before Franz came into the world in 1883. The causes were the ordinary killers of infants in that era: illness, infection, the fragile vulnerability of young children to a world without antibiotics. For Julie, each death was a catastrophe. She had carried these children, nursed them, watched them grow for a few precious months, and then lost them. This matters enormously. When Franz was born on the 3rd of July, 1883, he entered a household haunted by ghosts. 2 empty cradles, 2 small graves, a mother whose love was now inseparable from terror, terror that this child too would be taken from her. Julie's anxiety was suffocating. She watched Franz constantly. She worried over every cough, every fever, every sign that death might be circling again. Her love was real, but it came wrapped in fear, and fear is a poor substitute for the calm affection a child needs. Franz would later write of feeling watched, scrutinized, as if he existed under perpetual observation. The feeling began in infancy. And then there was Herman's reaction. His first 2 sons had died. What does a hard man do with grief? He buries it. He refuses to speak of it. He works harder, shouts louder, demands more from everyone around him. If he cannot control death, he will control everything else. Franz was the survivor, the replacement child, the one who lived while his brothers did not. Was there guilt in this? The psychology of replacement children suggests there often is a sense that one exists only because others cease to exist, that one's life is somehow borrowed or illegitimate. Franz never knew his brothers. He knew the weight of his parents' expectations, and he knew that weight was heavier because it should have been shared. 3 sisters followed: Ellie in 1889, Valley in 1890, and Otla in 1892. Herman finally had his surviving children, 1 son to carry on his name, 3 daughters to marry well. The Kafka family was complete. The household, however, was not a happy one. The fancy goods shop demanded both parents' presence. Herman and Julie worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. This was not unusual for the merchant class of Prague, but it meant that Franz and his sisters were raised largely by servants. A parade of nurses, cooks, and governesses passed through the household. None stayed long. Herman's temper drove them away, one after another. For a child, this constant turnover was destabilizing. The faces changed. The accents changed. The rules changed depending on who was in charge that week. The only constants were absence. His parents were always at the shop, and eruption when his father came home exhausted and angry and looking for targets. The Kafka apartment was spacious by Prague standards, but no amount of space could contain Herman's presence. When he entered a room, everything shifted. Conversations stopped. Servants tensed. Children froze. And at the dinner table, the theater of family life played out its nightly drama. Herman Kafka believed in education through criticism. A child learned by being corrected, constantly, loudly, in front of everyone. Franz was too thin. Franz ate too slowly. Franz sat incorrectly. Franz did not speak clearly. Franz had chosen the wrong friends. Franz was reading the wrong books. Franz was, in essence, always wrong. This might have been bearable if Herman had held himself to the same standards. He did not. He chewed with his mouth open. He cleaned his ears at the table. He cut his fingernails during meals. He did everything he forbade his children to do, and when they pointed out the contradiction, or worse, when Franz pointed it out because the boy had a sharp eye for hypocrisy, he exploded. The rules were simple. Herman Kafka could do as he pleased. Everyone else obeyed. There is a scene that Franz would describe decades later, in that 103-page letter that never reached its destination. A scene so small, so domestic, so seemingly trivial that it might be overlooked. It was not trivial. It was the moment a child understood what kind of world he inhabited. Franz was perhaps 3 or 4 years old. It was night. He woke thirsty and called for water. This was not unusual. Children wake, children ask for things, children are comforted and return to sleep, in most households. In the Kafka household, Hermann heard the whimpering. He rose from his bed. He went to his son's room. He picked up the small boy, carried him to the balcony, and set him down outside in his nightshirt. Then he closed the door and locked it. The night was cold. The child was alone. He stood on the balcony, shivering, bewildered, crying, and no one came. Eventually, Hermann unlocked the door and brought him back inside. Nothing was explained. No comfort was offered. The lesson, whatever it was supposed to be, was simply delivered. Decades later, Franz wrote, "After that night, I understood that asking for help was pointless." Was Hermann cruel? By the standards of his time and place, perhaps not exceptionally so. Many fathers believed that toughness produced strong children. Many fathers shouted, punished, demanded obedience. Hermann combined this harshness with something more corrosive: inconsistency. The rules changed depending on his mood. What was permitted on Tuesday might be forbidden on Wednesday. What earned praise in the morning might provoke rage by evening. A child could never be sure of his footing. The ground was always shifting. This is how anxiety is manufactured. Not through a single trauma, but through the constant impossibility of predicting what comes next. Franz became an expert reader of atmosphere, the particular quality of silence that preceded an explosion, the set of his father's shoulders that indicated danger. He absorbed the lesson that safety was an illusion. He absorbed the lesson that authority was arbitrary and absolute. And he absorbed something else. He absorbed hatred. Hatred in a child is complicated, though. Franz depended on his father. He needed his approval, his protection, his love, even if that love came wrapped in criticism and control. So the hatred turned inward. If father was always right and Franz was always wrong, then the problem must be Franz himself. He was flawed. He was inadequate. He was, as he would write much later, guilty without having done anything wrong. This is the emotional architecture that would produce the most distinctive literary voice of the 20th century. The boy grew. He attended school, a German-language gymnasium in a city where most people spoke Czech. This placed him in an odd position. He was German-speaking in a Czech city, Jewish in a Christian country, neither fully part of any community nor entirely excluded from all of them. The German students looked down on the Czech majority. The Czech students resented the German minority, and everyone looked askance at the Jews. Anti-Semitism was not abstract in Franz's childhood. It was real and present. There were taunts in the schoolyard. There were fights. There were moments when being Jewish meant being a target. There was also something more subtle, the sense of not quite belonging anywhere. Franz spoke German at home, studied in German at school, but the language around him on the streets was Czech. He was a stranger in his native city. This experience of perpetual outsiderness would mark his writing forever. His protagonists are men who do not belong, who cannot find their place in systems they do not understand, who are accused of crimes they cannot identify. They are, in essence, Franz Kafka, the boy who never knew where he stood. One place offered something like peace: books. He read voraciously. He discovered literature early and surrendered to it completely. Words on a page could not shout at him. Stories could not humiliate him at the dinner table. In books, there was order, beauty, escape. He read the German classics, Goethe, Schiller, Kleist. He read philosophy. He read everything he could find. Hermann did not understand this passion for reading. What use were books? They did not make money. They did not build businesses. They were a waste of time and indulgence, a symptom of the weakness he feared in his son. A real man worked. A real man built things. A real man did not sit in corners with his nose in a novel. The conflict was drawn. On one side, the father who had clawed his way up from poverty through sheer force of will, who valued only what was practical, measurable, profitable. On the other side, the son who lived in his imagination, who cared nothing for commerce, who dreamed of becoming a writer. They would never understand each other. They would never stop trying to change each other, and they would never escape each other. In 1901, Franz enrolled at the German University in Prague. He was 18 years old, tall and thin, with the large dark eyes that would become his most striking feature in photographs. The question of what to study provoked the predictable struggle with his father. Franz wanted to study literature. Hermann wanted him to study something useful. The compromise, if it can be called that, was law. A law degree was practical, respectable, and would qualify Franz for a government position. It was not what he wanted, but it was what he could accept without open warfare. The university years were transformative, though not primarily because of what Franz learned in his classes. Law bored him. He attended lectures dutifully, took notes, passed examinations, but his mind was elsewhere. His real education happened outside the lecture halls. In 1902, he met Max Brod. Brod was everything Franz was not. Short where Franz was tall, confident where Franz was diffident, sociable where Franz was solitary. He was a young writer of considerable ambition, already publishing articles and working on novels. He had opinions about everything and shared them freely. He was, in short, exactly the kind of person who might have intimidated Franz into silence. Instead, they became friends. More than friends, they became essential to each other. Brod recognized something in Franz that others missed: the quality of his mind, the originality of his perceptions, the extraordinary prose that emerged when he put pen to paper. Franz found in Brod something he desperately needed: someone who believed in him. Their friendship would last until Franz's death and beyond. It would shape the fate of his manuscripts, his reputation, his place in literary history. But that story comes later. For now, they were simply two young men discovering literature together, arguing about books, dreaming of futures as writers. Franz was discovering something else during these years: the nightlife of Prague. There is an image of Kafka that persists in popular imagination: the tortured ascetic, the sickly saint of literature, a man who lived like a monk and suffered beautifully. This image is not entirely false, but it is incomplete. The young Franz Kafka was more complicated. He visited brothels. This is documented in his diaries, though early editors, including Brod himself, censored the more explicit passages. Franz wrote frankly about his experiences with prostitutes, about his desires, about the gap between his fantasies and his actual experiences. He collected erotica. He struggled with guilt about his sexuality while continuing to indulge it. "I passed by the brothel as if past the house of a beloved," he wrote in his diary. This should not be surprising. He was a young man in a city with a thriving sex trade, at a time when bourgeois young men routinely separated their respectable public lives from their private indulgences. It complicates the portrait, though. Franz was not a disembodied intellect. He was a man with a body, with desires, with a full range of human appetites. He was also politically engaged in ways that are often overlooked. The Prague of his youth was a cauldron of competing nationalisms and radical ideologies. Czech nationalism was rising. German speakers felt threatened. Anarchist and socialist ideas circulated among students and intellectuals. Franz attended meetings. He read radical literature. He engaged with ideas that questioned the foundations of the society his father had worked so hard to join. This, too, was a form of rebellion. Hermann Kafka was a pillar of bourgeois respectability. His son flirted with ideas that would tear down everything Hermann had built. The most surprising aspect of young Franz might be this: he was athletic. The pale, ethereal figure of legend was, in fact, a dedicated swimmer, a rower, an enthusiastic hiker. He practiced the Müller system of Swedish gymnastics, performing his exercises naked at an open window, even in January. He believed in physical culture, in the health of the body, in the importance of movement and fresh air. The irony is bitter. This man who worked so hard to strengthen his body would be destroyed by tuberculosis before his 41st birthday. For now, he swam in the Vltava River, rode with friends, took long walks through the Bohemian countryside. His body was thin but strong. His health was good. There is another irony. He practiced vegetarianism from around 1915 onward, believing that a plant-based diet would improve his health and clarify his mind. He was interested in natural healing, in alternative approaches to wellness. He sought health with the dedication of someone who feared its loss. And he could not sleep. Insomnia plagued him throughout his adult life. Night after night he lay awake while the city slept, his mind racing, his body exhausted but unable to rest. When sleep did come, It was shallow and unrefreshing. He woke tired and remained tired throughout the day. He suffered from headaches, 2 crushing migraines that left him incapacitated. And there were darker episodes, times when his thoughts turned toward self-destruction. His diaries contain references to suicidal ideation, moments when ending his life seemed like a reasonable solution to the problem of being Franz Kafka. Modern psychiatrists, reading his letters and diaries, have speculated about diagnoses: schizoid personality disorder, depression with anxious features. The categories of his era were different from ours, and he was never formally diagnosed with any mental illness. Something was wrong, though. Something had been wrong since childhood. Something would remain wrong until the end. And yet he created. In the spaces between insomnia and exhaustion, between the demands of work and the chaos of family, between his father's contempt and his own self-doubt, he wrote. He also drew. This is less well known. Franz Kafka left behind some 150 drawings, quick sketches, many of them rendered in ink with a spare, expressive line. Some are abstract, almost geometric. Others are humorous, capturing figures in absurd postures. They reveal an artist's eye, a visual imagination that complemented his verbal gifts. He kept this private, as he kept almost everything private. The drawings were for himself. The early writings were for himself. He was not ready to share, not ready to expose his inner world to the judgment he feared and expected. In 1906, Franz completed his law degree. He was 23 years old, qualified for nothing he actually wanted to do, prepared to enter a profession he did not care about. The university years were over. Real life, the life his father approved of, was about to begin. He completed a year of unpaid legal practice, as was required for all law graduates. Then he needed to find employment. In 1908, he secured a position at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia. It was a semi-governmental organization, bureaucratic and stable, exactly the kind of respectable position Hermann Kafka had envisioned for his son. Franz would work there for 14 years. This demands some attention because it contradicts the romantic image of the suffering artist. Kafka was not a starving bohemian. He was a civil servant. He had a salary, colleagues, responsibilities. He wrote reports on workplace safety, inspected factories, processed claims. He was good at his job, his superiors valued him, promoted him, gave him increasing responsibility. The work was not meaningless. The institute dealt with industrial accidents, with workers who lost fingers to machines, who fell from scaffolding, who were poisoned by chemicals. Franz saw the human cost of industrialization. He visited dangerous workplaces and wrote recommendations for improvement. He made a real difference in the safety of real workers. The real irony of his career is this: he spent his days navigating bureaucracy, processing forms, attending meetings, dealing with the machinery of a large organization. Then he went home and wrote about men trapped in incomprehensible systems, accused by courts whose procedures they cannot understand, seeking entry to castles whose authorities will never admit them. He lived the nightmare he would immortalize. His schedule was punishing. The institute demanded his presence from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. He returned home for lunch with his family, another opportunity for his father to critique him. Then he tried to sleep until 11 at night. Sleep rarely cooperated, and from 11 until 6 in the morning he wrote. This was when the real work happened. In the silent hours after midnight, when his parents slept, when the city was dark and still, Franz sat at his desk and descended into himself. The words came then, sometimes pouring out in torrents. The exhaustion that plagued his days somehow released him at night. In the darkness, he was free. It was during one of these nights, specifically the night of September 22nd to 23rd, 1912, that everything changed. But before we reach that breakthrough, before the nights of furious creation that would produce his first masterpieces, there is another story to tell. A story of women pursued and abandoned, loved and feared, drawn close and pushed away. A story that reveals Franz Kafka not only as victim, but as someone who caused suffering in others. Over 5 years, he wrote her more than 500 letters, sometimes 2 in a single day, sometimes 3. He poured himself onto the page, his fears, his hopes, his dreams, his doubts. He told her things he had never told anyone. He made her the repository of his entire inner life. And yet, when she wanted to visit him, He begged her not to come. Her name was Phyllis Bauer. She was 24 years old when they met, a working woman in an era when most women of her class did not work. She held a responsible position at a company that manufactured dictation machines. She was practical, organized, efficient, everything Franz was not. She had a round face, a gap between her front teeth, and an air of solid capability that both attracted and terrified him. They met on August 13, 1912 at the home of Max Brod. Franz was visiting his friend. Phyllis was there too, a relative of the Brod family, passing through Prague on her way back to Berlin. The encounter was brief. They spoke for perhaps an hour. Franz noted her appearance in his diary with unusual attention to detail: her face, her clothes, the way she carried herself. 3 weeks later, he sent her the first letter. What began that night would consume 5 years of both their lives. It would produce some of the most extraordinary correspondence in literary history, and some of the most agonizing human drama. Franz Kafka, the man who could not finish his novels, who could not live up to his father's expectations, who could not find peace in his own skin, would prove equally incapable of either marrying this woman or letting her go. The letters are remarkable documents. In them, Franz reveals himself completely: his writing struggles, his office frustrations, his family torments, his physical ailments. He writes to Phyllis about his insomnia, his digestive problems, his headaches. He describes his daily routine in minute detail. He shares drafts of his stories and solicits her opinion. He makes her essential to his creative life. There is something strange about this courtship, though. It is conducted almost entirely on paper. Franz lives in Prague. Phyllis lives in Berlin. The distance is not vast, a train journey of several hours, but Franz treats it as if it were an ocean. He writes constantly but visits rarely. When Phyllis proposes coming to see him, he invents reasons why she should not. "Don't come," he writes. "I am unwell. I am not fit for company. I am not the man you think I am." She came anyway sometimes, and when she did, the meetings were awkward, difficult, nothing like the intimacy of the letters. In person, Franz froze. The words that flowed so freely on paper dried up in his throat. He could not be the man he was in his correspondence. The gap between his written self and his physical self was unbridgeable. This tendency, intense connection through writing, painful distance in person, would define all his relationships with women. It was as if Franz could only love at a remove, could only be vulnerable when protected by paper and ink and miles of separation. Intimacy at close range was too dangerous. It meant being seen. It meant being judged. It meant the possibility of rejection in real time, without the buffer of composition and revision. Yet he pressed forward. In the spring of 1914, after nearly 2 years of correspondence, Franz Kafka and Phyllis Bauer became engaged. The engagement was announced, congratulations were offered, a wedding date was discussed. Franz's father was for once pleased his son was finally doing something sensible, something normal, something that Hermann himself understood. A good woman, a respectable match. Perhaps the boy would turn out all right after all. Franz was already suffocating, however. The prospect of marriage filled him with dread. Not because he did not love Phyllis, he did in his way. Marriage meant the end of something essential, though. It meant domesticity, routine, the demands of a shared life. It meant less time for writing, less solitude, less freedom to descend into himself during those midnight hours when his real work happened. Marriage, he feared, would kill him as a writer. He began to sabotage. There was another woman involved now, a friend of Phyllis's named Gret Bloch. She had been brought in as an intermediary, someone to smooth the communication between the engaged couple during one of their difficult patches. Instead, she became something else entirely. Franz began writing to Gret. Not innocent letters, not purely friendly correspondence, but something more intimate. He was pouring out his doubts about the engagement to his fiancée's own friend. He was creating a secret channel that excluded Phyllis. He was betraying her trust while still wearing her ring. Years later, after Franz's death, Gret Bloch told Max Brod that she had borne a son and that Franz was the father. The boy had died in 1921, she said, at the age of 7. The claim sent shockwaves through Kafka scholarship. Had the tortured writer abandoned his own child? Modern biographers have examined the evidence carefully and concluded that the story is almost certainly false. There was no affair and no child. The dates do not align. The circumstances do not support the story. Gret may have been confused or seeking connection to a man who had become famous after his death. The truth died with her. The uncertainty lingers, though. The possibility that Franz Kafka fathered and abandoned a son adds a darker dimension to his story, one that transforms him from victim to perpetrator. Even if untrue, the accusation reveals something important. Other people paid the price for Franz's inability to commit, to decide, to follow through. In July of 1914, the engagement collapsed. The setting was a hotel in Berlin, the Askenischer Hof. Franz arrived to find not just Phyllis but her sister and Gret Bloch as well. The three women confronted him. They had compared notes. They knew about the letters to Gret, the doubts he had expressed, the ways he had played them against each other. Franz would later describe this scene in his diary. He called it a tribunal, a court, a judgment rendered against him in a hotel room with a woman he was supposed to marry as prosecutor, judge, and jury combined. He sat silent while they spoke. He did not defend himself. He accepted the verdict. "You have treated me badly," Phyllis said. "You have lied to me. You have made me a fool." He could not argue. Every word was true. The engagement was broken. Here is the thing about Franz Kafka, though. He could not let go any more than he could hold on. Within months, the letters to Phyllis resumed. The cycle began again, declarations of love, expressions of doubt, approaches and retreats. For 3 more years, they would continue this dance of mutual torture. In 1917, they became engaged again. Nothing had changed. Franz was still terrified of marriage. Phyllis was still hoping he would overcome his fears. They were still fundamentally incompatible, she wanting a normal life, he incapable of providing one. And then in August of that year, Franz coughed blood. It happened in the middle of the night, around 3 in the morning. He woke with a strange sensation in his chest, coughed, and saw the red stain spreading across his handkerchief. He knew immediately what it meant. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, the disease that had become almost romantic in the literary imagination, but that was in reality a slow and terrible way to die. His reaction was not what one might expect. In his diary, he wrote of feeling almost relieved. The diagnosis gave him something he had never been able to give himself: permission. Permission to break the engagement without being the villain. Permission to retreat from the expectations of normal life. Permission to be sick instead of merely strange. "The infection in my lungs is only a symbol," he wrote. A symbol of a wound that had been there much longer, a wound inflicted in childhood, a wound that had never healed. In December 1917, the second engagement to Phyllis ended. This time, it was final. She would go on to marry another man, emigrate to America, live a long and ordinary life. She kept Franz's letters until her death. They were published decades later, revealing the full scope of the obsession she had endured. 5 years, 500 letters, 2 engagements, no marriage. Perhaps Franz himself understood best. "I am unable to live with anyone," he wrote. "I could not bear a shared life. I am incapable of the compromises, the concessions, the ordinary give and take that marriage requires." This was not modesty or self-pity. It was accurate self-assessment. He knew what he was. He simply could not change it. The damage was real, however. Phyllis Bauer spent 5 years of her youth on a man who was never going to marry her. She endured the humiliation of the Berlin tribunal, the confusion of his mixed signals, the exhaustion of trying to love someone who would not let himself be loved. When biographers write about Franz's suffering, they sometimes forget that he caused suffering too. The wounded become wounders. The child who was judged learned to inflict judgment. The cycle continues. After Phyllis, there were others. In 1919, Franz met Julie Woreisig at a sanatorium. He was there for his lungs. She was the daughter of a cobbler, a working-class woman with no pretensions to intellectual life. She was warm, funny, uncomplicated. They became engaged within months. Once again, Hermann Kafka intervened. Franz's father had tolerated Phyllis. She was respectable, educated from a proper family. Julie Woreisig was different. In Hermann's eyes, she was beneath them, a cobbler's daughter, probably a gold digger, certainly not suitable for a Kafka. He made his opinions known in the most vicious terms possible. "She probably picked out some fancy blouse," Hermann said. The way those Prague Jewesses know how to do, and you decided to marry her. It was worse than that. Herman compared Julie to the women in brothels, suggesting that his son's fiancée was little better than a prostitute. The insult was crushing, not just to Julie but to Franz himself. It implied that he was incapable of attracting a decent woman, that he could only find love among the degraded and desperate. This was the catalyst for the letter. In the weeks that followed, Franz sat down and wrote those 103 pages. All the rage that had accumulated over 36 years poured out of him. He cataloged every humiliation, every injustice, every moment when his father had made him feel small and worthless. He explained how Herman's parenting had crippled him, had made him incapable of love, of marriage, of ordinary human connection. The letter was an attempt to explain, to make his father understand, to finally be seen and heard. It failed before it was delivered. Julie Kafka took the sealed envelope from her son and never gave it to her husband. The engagement to Julie Worizek dissolved. Franz moved on. Another woman, another failure, another retreat into solitude. And then came Milna. Milna Jesenska was unlike any woman Franz had known. She was Czech, not German. She was married, not available. She was fierce, brilliant, uncompromising. She translated his stories into Czech and wrote to him about her work. Her letters caught fire, so did he. Milna was 23 years old, more than a decade younger than Franz. Her husband, Ernst Pollack, was a Jewish intellectual, charming, unfaithful, unable to give her what she needed. Their marriage was miserable, but she would not leave. She was Catholic and divorce was complicated. Perhaps she was also not quite ready to be free. The correspondence between Franz and Milna is different from the Fellis letters. There is less negotiation, less anxiety about practical arrangements. There is more passion, more honesty, more desperation. Franz wrote to her, "I am dirty, endlessly dirty. That is why I make such a fuss about purity. No one sings as purely as those who are in deepest hell." She understood him in a way Fellis never had. She was a writer herself, and she grasped the demons that drove him. She did not try to cure him or change him. She simply saw him. They met in person only a few times. Days of talking, walking, an intimacy he had never achieved with anyone else. Franz begged her to leave her husband. She could not or would not. He retreated as he always did. Something was different this time, however. Before the relationship faded, Franz did something extraordinary. He gave Milna his diaries. Think about what this means. His diaries were his most private documents, the record of his inner life, his darkest thoughts, his most shameful confessions. He guarded them obsessively. No one had read them, not Broad, not his family, not any of the women he had claimed to love. Yet he handed them to Milna, a woman he had known for only a few months. It was an act of trust he had never managed before. It was also, perhaps, a goodbye. The relationship faded. Milna remained married to Pollack for several more years before finally divorcing him. She became a journalist, a resistance fighter, a woman of remarkable courage. When the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, she helped Jews escape. She was arrested, sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, and died there in 1944. Before her arrest, she managed to save some of Franz's letters. A friend preserved them through the war years. They were published eventually, decades later, another window into the soul of a man who had been dead for 20 years before the world discovered what it had lost. Milna was the woman Franz loved most deeply. She was also the one who rejected him, not cruelly, but definitively. She would not leave her husband for him. She would not rebuild her life around his needs. She loved him, but she loved her freedom more. Perhaps that is why he loved her back. She was unattainable in a way that made the relationship safe. He could pour himself out to her without ever having to face the terror of actual daily intimacy. There was one more woman, one final relationship, and this one would be different. Her name was Dora Diamond. She was 19 years old when they met, more than 20 years his junior, young enough to be his daughter. She was Polish, from a Hasidic family, working at a summer camp for Jewish children on the Baltic coast. Franz was there on vacation, trying to escape the pressures of Prague, trying to breathe the sea air with his damaged lungs. He saw her in the kitchen of the camp, gutting fish. He was captivated immediately. Dora was unlike any of the other women in his life. She was not intellectual, not literary, not part of the Prague circles that had shaped his existence. She was simple in the best sense, direct, warm, uncomplicated by the neuroses that tangled everyone France knew. She laughed easily. She loved without calculation. She did not try to analyze him or improve him. And France, for the first time in his life, decided to stop running. In September of 1923, he did something he had never done before. He left home. Not temporarily, not for a sanatorium stay, but permanently. He moved to Berlin to live with Dora. He was 40 years old. He had never lived outside his parents' household for more than a few months at a time. He had spent his entire adult life under his father's roof, eating at his father's table, subject to his father's judgments. Now, finally, he was free. The Berlin months were the happiest of his life. They had almost no money. Germany was in the grip of hyperinflation, and the currency France brought from Prague became worthless within weeks. They lived in a series of cheap rooms. They ate poorly. The winter was brutal, and heating was a luxury they could not afford. None of it mattered. For the first time, France was living on his own terms. He and Dora studied Hebrew together. He had become interested in Zionism, in the possibility of emigrating to Palestine, in reconnecting with the Jewish heritage he had neglected his whole life. They read, they talked, they were happy. He even proposed to her father. This was a different kind of proposal than the ones before. France wrote to Dora's father, a devout Hasidic man, asking for permission to marry her. The father did what any traditional Jewish father would do. He consulted his rabbi. The rabbi said no. We do not know the rabbi's reasoning. Perhaps he sensed that France was dying. The tuberculosis was advancing rapidly, and his condition was visibly deteriorating. Perhaps he intuited some incompatibility. Perhaps it was simply a matter of religious differences, a secular Prague Jew being unsuitable for a Hasidic daughter. Whatever the reason, the refusal came. Once again, a father figure had stood between France and marriage. This time, it was not his own father. This time, Hermann Kafka had nothing to do with it. The pattern had become so ingrained that it reproduced itself even when the original antagonist was absent. France and Dora stayed together anyway. They did not need a rabbi's blessing. They did not need official sanction. They had each other, and that was enough. Time was running out, however. During the Berlin months, France and Dora burned manuscripts together. We do not know exactly what was destroyed. Dora later said that she watched stories go into the fire, pages of work that the world would never see. France wanted them gone. He was erasing himself, preparing for an end he knew was coming. Now let us return to the work itself, to those nights of creation that produced the writings the world would come to treasure. The breakthrough came on the night of September 22, 1912. France was 29 years old. He had been writing for years, but nothing he produced satisfied him. Fragments accumulated in drawers. Stories began and stalled. The voice he was seeking remained elusive. That night something shifted. He sat at his desk after 11 as usual. The family was asleep. Prague was quiet. He began to write, not knowing what would emerge, simply following the words as they came. The story concerned a young man named Georg, his aging father, a mysterious friend in Russia, a fiancé who did not understand. For 8 hours he did not stop. His hand moved across the page with a fluency he had never experienced before. The sentences connected. The images cohered. The story built towards something, he did not know what until he arrived there. At the climax, the father, who has seemed weak and confused throughout, suddenly rises from his bed and pronounces judgment. He condemns his son. He sentences him to death by drowning. And the son, without protest, without appeal, accepts the verdict. He runs to a bridge and throws himself into the water. When dawn light appeared at his window, France had completed the judgment. He stood, his legs cramped from sitting so long, his body stiff with exhaustion and exhilaration. He went to his diary and wrote, "Only in this way can writing be done, only with such coherence, with such a complete opening out of the body and the soul." He had found his voice. He had discovered that his fiction could draw directly from his deepest wounds, the father who judged and condemned, the son who accepted guilt without crime, the verdict that came without explanation. The personal had become the universal. In the weeks that followed, the floodgates remained open. In November, he wrote The Metamorphosis, the story that would become his most famous work. Gregor Samsa wakes one morning to discover he has been transformed into a monstrous insect. His family is horrified. His employer is outraged. The world that seemed to accommodate him reveals that its acceptance was conditional on his usefulness, and when that usefulness ends, so does the accommodation. The story took 3 weeks to complete. Franz wrote it in a fever of creation, the same total absorption that had produced The Judgment. When he finished, he knew he had made something extraordinary. That same period saw the beginning of his first novel. He called it The Man Who Disappeared, though it would later be published under the title America. It told the story of a young man sent to America by his parents after a scandal, his adventures in a country he does not understand, his gradual descent through the social strata of the New World. Franz had never been to America. He based his descriptions on books, photographs, and pure imagination. The result is not realistic. The geography is wrong. The Statue of Liberty holds a sword instead of a torch. Realism was never the point, however. The novel captured something essential about displacement, about being a stranger in a strange land, about the impossibility of ever finding solid ground beneath one's feet. He never finished it. The manuscript broke off in the middle of a chapter, one more fragment in a career of fragments. In 1914, he started The Trial. In 1922, he started The Castle. Both remained incomplete at his death. Both were published posthumously in forms their author never approved. Both became landmarks of world literature despite, or because of, their unfinished state. Why could he not complete them? The easy answer is perfectionism. Nothing satisfied him. Every sentence could be improved. Every chapter revealed flaws that demanded revision. He was his own harshest critic, and his standards were impossible to meet. There is another possibility, though. Perhaps he could not finish because finishing would have meant closure, and closure was something Franz Kafka could not achieve in any area of his life. 3 engagements, no marriages. 3 novels, no conclusions. The pattern was consistent. He could begin but not end, approach but not arrive, desire but not possess. The novels themselves are about this impossibility. Joseph K., in The Trial, seeks to understand his accusation and clear his name. He never succeeds. K., in The Castle, seeks entry to the castle and recognition from its authorities. He never achieves it. The novel simply stops mid-sentence, as if even the narrative itself could not find its way through. These are not failed attempts at traditional storytelling. They are radical formal innovations, works that use incompletion as a structural principle. The lack of ending is the point. In a world without meaning, without justice, without accessible authority, how could there be resolution? There is one more aspect of his creative life that deserves attention: his humor. The popular image of Kafka is relentlessly grim, a tortured soul producing tortured work, everything darkness and despair. This image is incomplete. The man who wrote The Metamorphosis also laughed until he could not breathe while reading it aloud to friends. Max Brod recalled evenings when Franz would share new work with a small circle of intimates. On one such occasion, reading the first chapter of The Trial, Franz began laughing so hard that he had to stop. The absurdity of Joseph K.'s situation, arrested without explanation, expected to navigate a legal system that makes no sense, struck Franz as hilarious. His friends laughed with him, though they were never quite sure if they were laughing at the same thing. The American novelist Philip Roth called him a sit-down comedian, a comic writer whose humor operates through deadpan absurdity rather than jokes. The comedy is built into the situations, the logic, the perfectly serious treatment of perfectly ridiculous premises. A man turns into a bug and his main concern is getting to work on time. That is funny. It is also horrifying. The two responses are not contradictory. Franz knew that his work was comic as well as tragic. He chose his titles with dark wit: The Judgment, The Trial, The Castle, words that evoke solemnity and authority while describing their absence or perversion. This humor was not an escape from pain. It was a response to pain, a way of making the unbearable bearable. If you can laugh at the nightmare, you have gained some small power over it. Franz Kafka, the tortured artist, was also Franz Kafka, the wit. The two were not different people. They were aspects of the same complicated soul. For 5 years after that breakthrough night, France lived between two worlds, the daylight world of insurance claims and the midnight world of creation. His body seemed to cooperate, despite the insomnia, despite the headaches, despite all the signs that something was not quite right. Then, in the summer of 1917, the body delivered its verdict. The blood came at 3 in the morning on a night in early August. He woke with a strange sensation in his chest, coughed into his handkerchief, and saw the stain spreading in the dim light. Even before he lit a lamp, he knew what it meant. Tuberculosis. In that era, the diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. There were no antibiotics, no effective treatments. Patients were sent to sanatoriums in the mountains, where they breathed clean air and rested and hoped for remission. Some improved for a time. Most declined. The bacteria worked slowly, eating away at the lungs, stealing breath and strength until there was nothing left. Franz's first reaction was what one might expect: fear, dismay, the recognition that his life had just taken a terrible turn. His second reaction, following close behind, was stranger. He felt relieved. This demands explanation. How could a diagnosis of tuberculosis bring relief? Franz explained it himself, in letters and diary entries composed in the weeks that followed. The illness gave him something he had never been able to give himself: an excuse. He could not marry Phyllis now. How could he ask a woman to tie herself to a dying man? He could not maintain his position at the Institute indefinitely. His health would not permit it. He could not be expected to fulfill the ordinary obligations of an ordinary life. He was sick. The disease became his alibi. For years, he had failed to marry, failed to establish an independent household, failed to become the responsible adult his father expected. These failures had tormented him with guilt. Now they could be attributed to something beyond his control. Not his weakness, but his lungs. Not his neurosis, but his bacteria. The infection is only a symbol, he wrote to Milne years later, a symbol of a deeper wound, a wound that had been there since childhood. The tuberculosis was the physical manifestation of a spiritual sickness that had always been present. His body was finally expressing what his soul had felt all along. This is not medical science. It is psychology, metaphor, self-justification, all tangled together in ways that cannot be separated. What matters is that Franz embraced his illness even as he fought it. The disease gave him permission to be who he already was. The sanatoriums became his second home. Over the next 7 years, he would spend months at a time in these peculiar institutions, part hospital, part spa, part waiting room for death. The first extended stay was at Zurau, where his sister Atla had a small farm. It was not a sanatorium in the formal sense, but a place of retreat. Franz spent 9 months there, from September 1917 to April 1918, resting, reading, writing. He produced no major fiction during this period, but he filled notebooks with aphorisms, compressed, crystalline observations that would be published after his death. "A cage went in search of a bird," he wrote, "and from a certain point onward there is no longer any turning back. That is the point that must be reached. And there is infinite hope, but not for us." These fragments reveal a mind turning inward, grappling with questions of existence and meaning. The illness forced a kind of concentration. There was no time for sprawling novels that might never be finished. There was only time for these brief, brilliant insights. After Zurau came other retreats: Murano in the Italian Alps, Matlieri in the Tatra Mountains, Spindlemuhl. The sanatorium world was a subculture unto itself. Patients lived in a strange limbo, neither fully sick nor fully well, their days structured around rest, fresh air, and carefully monitored meals. They formed friendships with fellow sufferers, conducted romances that burned bright against the backdrop of mortality. Franz fit into this world more easily than he had ever fit into the healthy world outside. Here, everyone was damaged. Here, weakness was not a failing but a shared condition. Here, no one expected him to be normal because no one was normal. He tried various treatments. The medicine of the era had little to offer against tuberculosis: no antibiotics, no effective drugs. Instead, there were theories: fresh air and rest, or fresh air and exercise. Sunbathing, sometimes nude. Special diets, often vegetarian. Franz, who had been moving toward vegetarianism anyway, embraced the dietary prescriptions enthusiastically. He lay on balconies in the winter cold, breathing deeply. He walked mountain paths when his strength permitted. He attempted to heal himself through sheer force of will, as if the body could be persuaded by the mind's determination. It did not work. Tuberculosis is caused by bacteria, and bacteria do not respond to willpower. The sanatorium stays gave him time, though time to write, time to think, time to compose the works that would emerge from these years of illness. In 1922, the institute finally released him. He was 39 years old, and his health had deteriorated to the point where even part-time work was impossible. He retired on a disability pension. The career that had sustained him financially for 14 years was over. He was free now to write full-time, but his body was failing. He began The Castle that year, the story of a land surveyor who arrives at a village governed by an inaccessible castle, whose authorities will neither admit nor reject him, who exists in a permanent state of waiting for recognition that never comes. The novel remained unfinished. France worked on it through the summer and fall, but the words came harder now. The illness was progressing. Energy was scarce. The manuscript broke off mid-sentence, as if even the narrative had run out of breath. Then came Dora and Berlin, and the brief period of happiness we have already described. Then came the final decline. By early 1924, the tuberculosis had spread to his larynx. This was the cruelest development possible. The bacteria that had colonized his lungs now attacked his throat. Swallowing became agony. Speech became impossible. The man of words was robbed of his voice. Think about what this meant for a writer. France had lived through language. Writing was his escape, his identity, his reason for existing. Now speech itself was being taken from him. He communicated through slips of paper, scribbling messages to Dora and the doctors, his voice reduced to handwriting. And still he worked. In those final months, while dying, while unable to eat solid food, while racked with pain, France corrected the proofs of his last story. It was called Josephine the Singer, or The Mouse Folk. It told of a performer who captivates her community with her voice, but whose voice is perhaps not so different from ordinary squeaking, whose art may be more about the listening than the singing. It was a story about losing one's voice. He finished revising it days before he could no longer hold a pen. The sanatorium at Kierling outside Vienna was where the end came. It was a pleasant place, as such places went clean, professional, staffed by doctors who knew they could not save their patients but tried to ease their dying. France had a room with a view of gardens. Dora was with him constantly. Robert Klopstock, a young medical student who had become his friend, visited daily. The pain was terrible. Tuberculosis of the larynx is an exceptionally cruel way to die. Every swallow is agony. Every breath is labored. The body demands food and water that it cannot receive. Death comes through starvation and dehydration as much as through infection. France could no longer speak. He wrote notes on slips of paper, handing them to Dora and the doctors. Some of these slips survive, pathetic, poignant records of a man reduced to written whispers. Water, one reads, not to drink, just to see it. Dora brought a glass and held it where the light caught the surface. France watched the reflections play across the ceiling. It was, perhaps, the last beautiful thing he saw. On another slip he wrote something harder. He was in terrible pain, and he knew there was no hope. He asked Klopstock for more morphine, not just to ease his suffering, but to end it. "Kill me," he wrote, "or else you are a murderer." The logic was characteristic, precise, paradoxical, inescapable. If you do not end my suffering, you are prolonging it. The humane act and the lethal act are the same. Klopstock increased the morphine dose. Whether this hastened death or merely eased the passage cannot be known with certainty. The line between palliative care and euthanasia was blurry then, as it remains now. What is certain is that Franz Kafka stopped breathing on June 3, 1924. He was 40 years old, just weeks short of his 41st birthday. Dora was at his bedside. She would never fully recover from the loss. She lived for nearly 3 more decades, surviving the Holocaust that consumed so many others from France's world, but she never stopped mourning him. He had been her great love, brief, intense, transformative. The funeral was held in Prague. Hermann and Julie Kafka attended, along with other family members and friends. It was a modest affair. France had not been famous in life, and his death did not occasion major public mourning. The newspapers noted his passing briefly. A few literary acquaintances wrote obituaries praising his work while acknowledging that it remained largely unknown. He was buried in the New Jewish Cemetery, in a grave that would later be marked by a simple monument. His parents would join him there, Herman in 1931, Julie in 1934. His sisters would not be so fortunate. Ellie, Vali, and Atla, the three sisters who had grown up in the shadow of their brother's strange genius, were all murdered in the Holocaust. Ellie and Vali were transported to the Lodz ghetto and then to the Chelmno extermination camp, where they were killed in 1942. Atla survived longer. She had married a Catholic and converted, which provided some protection. In 1943, she volunteered to accompany a transport of children to Auschwitz. She knew what awaited her there. She went anyway. If Franz had lived, would he have shared their fate? Almost certainly. He was Jewish by birth, regardless of his complicated relationship with the faith. The Nazis made no distinctions based on religious observance or cultural assimilation. They would have come for him as they came for his sisters. The tuberculosis that seemed like a curse may have been a strange kind of mercy. It killed him at 40, but it spared him from the gas chambers. He died in his bed, surrounded by people who loved him, rather than in the machinery of industrial murder. This is cold comfort. It is no comfort at all, really. It is simply part of the historical context in which Franz Kafka's life and death must be understood. He left behind a suitcase full of manuscripts, novels, stories, diaries, letters, years of work, most of it unpublished. He had given clear instructions about what should be done with this material. Burn everything. He wrote the instructions twice, to make sure there was no misunderstanding. The first note came in 1921 when death still seemed distant. Franz addressed it to Max Brod, his closest friend, the man who had believed in his work from the beginning. The language was direct. Everything he left behind, diaries, manuscripts, letters, sketches, was to be burned, unread, without exception. The second note came in 1922, more emphatic than the first. Dearest Max, my last request. Everything I leave behind me in the way of diaries, manuscripts, letters, my own and others, sketches, and so on to be burned unread. He added instructions about work that had already been published. Those few stories that had appeared in magazines and small editions during his lifetime could remain in print if anyone wanted them. They should not be reprinted, though. They should not be promoted. They should be allowed to fade into obscurity. This was not false modesty. Franz genuinely believed that his writing had failed. The novels were unfinished, the stories imperfect, the whole body of work a record of inadequacy rather than achievement. He did not want it preserved. He did not want future generations picking through his failures. He wanted oblivion. Max Brod received these instructions. He read them carefully, and then he did nothing of the kind. This is the betrayal that created modern literature. Without Brod's refusal to honor his friend's dying wish, there would be no trial, no castle, no posthumous collections. The world would never have heard of Franz Kafka. The name that has become synonymous with a certain kind of modern nightmare, Kafkisk, we say, and everyone knows what we mean, would have been forgotten within a generation. Why did Brod disobey? He offered an explanation later when questions were raised. According to Brod, he had told Franz explicitly that he would not carry out such instructions. If you really want your work destroyed, he claimed to have said, you should ask someone else. I will not do it. Franz, by this account, knew that Brod would preserve the manuscripts and chose him as executor anyway, which meant that the instructions were not truly meant to be followed. This explanation is convenient. It absolves Brod of responsibility by reframing the betrayal as implicit permission. Whether it is true cannot be verified. Franz is not here to confirm or deny. The letters that might have contained such a conversation, if they existed, have not survived. What we know is this. Brod took the manuscripts and did not burn them. Instead, he began the long work of preparing them for publication. The first posthumous book appeared in 1925, just a year after Franz's death. It was The Trial, the novel about Joseph K. Arrested without explanation, condemned without understanding, executed without resolution. Brod had edited the manuscript, imposing an order on chapters that Franz had left unnumbered, making decisions about sequence and inclusion that shaped how readers would encounter the work. The book was not an immediate sensation. It sold modestly, was reviewed respectfully, and found a small audience of admirers. Franz Kafka was not yet famous. He was merely a dead writer whose friend had published his unfinished novel. The Castle followed in 1926. America came in 1927. The diaries and letters trickled out over subsequent decades. Slowly, steadily, the body of work accumulated. How much of what we read is Franz Kafka, and how much is Max Brod? This question has troubled scholars ever since the manuscripts became available for examination. Brod was not a neutral transmitter. He had opinions about what the novels meant, how they should be structured, which passages belonged and which did not. His editorial choices reflected those opinions. Later scholarly editions working from the original manuscripts have revealed variations that Brod smoothed over or eliminated. The Kafka we read is partly a construction of his friend's editorial vision. The words are Franz's words. The visions are Franz's visions. The presentation, the framing, the emphasis, these bear Brod's fingerprints. Brod did something else that shaped Franz's legacy. He wrote about him. He produced a biography published in 1937 that established the framework through which Franz would be understood for decades. The biography portrayed him as a saint of literature, a tormented genius, a man too pure for the world he inhabited. It downplayed aspects that complicated this image, the brothel visits, the difficult treatment of women, the ways Franz had caused suffering as well as experienced it. The image stuck. For generations, readers encountered Kafka through Brod's lens. Only later, as scholars gained access to uncensored diaries and letters, did a more complicated portrait emerge. Brod believed in his friend's genius with absolute conviction. That belief drove him to preserve the manuscripts, edit them, promote them, build a literary reputation from the fragments Franz had left behind. Without that conviction, the world would never have heard of Kafka. Conviction can shade into appropriation, however. Brod made himself the gatekeeper of Kafka's legacy. He controlled access to manuscripts. He shaped interpretation. He became, in some sense, co-author of the Kafka phenomenon. Whether this was service or exploitation is a question that admits no easy answer. What is certain is that Franz did not want it. He asked for destruction. He asked to be forgotten. His friend's refusal was an act of love, an act of literary judgment, and an act of profound disrespect for the dead man's wishes. It was all of these things simultaneously. The manuscripts traveled with Brod when the darkness came to Europe. In March of 1939, German troops occupied Prague. The Czechoslovak state ceased to exist. Jews were immediately at risk, their businesses seized, their movements restricted, their lives increasingly circumscribed by the Nazi machinery of persecution. Brod saw what was coming. He had contacts, resources, foresight. On March 15, 1939, the very day German forces entered Prague, he boarded one of the last trains leaving the city. In his luggage was a suitcase containing Franz Kafka's manuscripts. He left behind almost everything else. His own papers, his own work, the accumulated possessions of a lifetime, all abandoned. The Kafka manuscripts he carried with him, as if they were more precious than anything he personally owned. In a sense, they were. They were his friend's immortality, and he was their guardian. The train took him eventually to Palestine, to Tel Aviv, to a new life in a new land. Brod would spend the rest of his days there, continuing to write, continuing to edit and promote Kafka's work, continuing to shape the legacy he had preserved. Behind him in Prague, the catastrophe unfolded. The Jewish community that had produced Franz Kafka was systematically destroyed. Dora Diamant survived in London, but the Gestapo had seized her Berlin apartment years earlier and taken whatever remained there, including, according to Dora, some of Franz's manuscripts and letters that she had kept. What was in those confiscated papers? We do not know. Dora said there were notebooks, perhaps 20 of them, containing work that the world has never seen. The Gestapo filed them somewhere in their vast bureaucratic apparatus, and they have never resurfaced. They may have been destroyed in the chaos of the war's end. They may be moldering in some archive, waiting to be discovered. They may never have existed as Dora described them. The possibility haunts scholars. What if there are finished novels, complete stories, entire bodies of work that have been lost? What if the Kafka we know is only a fraction of the Kafka who existed? The questions cannot be answered. The silence of the archives is complete. Brod lived until 1968, dying in Tel Aviv at the age of 84. He had devoted the last 4 decades of his life to Kafka, editing, promoting, interpreting, defending. He had made his friend famous beyond anything France could have imagined or wanted. When Brod died, he left the Kafka manuscripts to his secretary, Esther Hoff. She was not a scholar, not a literary executor in any formal sense. She was simply the person who had helped Brod in his final years, the one he trusted to carry on his work. This decision would have consequences that took decades to unfold. Esther Hoff was not a careful custodian in the way a library or archive would be. She kept the manuscripts in her Tel Aviv apartment, surrounded by cats. The conditions were not ideal for preserving delicate papers. She also sold some items from the collection to private collectors, to institutions, to anyone willing to pay. This raised legal and ethical questions. Did Hoff own the manuscripts outright, with the right to sell them? Or was she merely a trustee, obligated to preserve them for posterity? Brod's will was ambiguous on this point. When Hoff died in 2007, at the age of 101, she left everything to her 2 daughters. They continued their mother's approach, keeping some manuscripts, selling others, resisting efforts to transfer the collection to public institutions. The State of Israel intervened. The government argued that the Kafka papers were cultural property of the Jewish people and should be housed in the National Library of Israel. The Hoff daughters disagreed. They preferred to sell to the highest bidder, possibly the German Literature Archive in Marbach. What followed was a legal battle that Franz Kafka himself might have invented. Years of litigation, conflicting claims and counterclaims, lawyers arguing about the intentions of men who had been dead for decades, a court trying to determine what Max Brod meant when he wrote his will, and what Franz Kafka meant when he wrote his instructions, and whether either man's wishes should bind the living. The irony was impossible to miss. Kafka, who had written about inaccessible authorities and incomprehensible legal proceedings, whose characters could never reach the powers that controlled their fates, his own papers had become trapped in exactly such a system. The man who described bureaucratic nightmares became their posthumous victim. The case wound through Israeli courts for nearly a decade. In 2016, the Supreme Court finally ruled. The manuscripts belonged to the National Library. The Hoff daughters were ordered to surrender them. The long custody battle was over. The papers are now in Jerusalem, available to scholars, exhibited for the public. The physical remnants of Franz Kafka's creative life have found their institutional home. Questions remain, however. Are all the manuscripts accounted for? What about the items Esther Hoff sold over the years? Where are they now? What about the papers the Gestapo seized from Dora Diamond? What about whatever Franz himself burned or destroyed before his death? The complete works of Franz Kafka may never be completely known. The archive is partial, the record incomplete. This seems fitting for a writer whose novels had no endings, whose vision was of a world where full understanding is forever withheld. And what of the work itself? How did the world come to recognize what Brod had preserved? The recognition was slow in coming. In the 1920s and 30s, Kafka was known only to a small circle of readers and literary connoisseurs, mostly German-speaking, who appreciated his strange and disturbing vision. The books were not bestsellers. The name was not famous. The Second World War changed everything. The horrors of the Holocaust, the machinery of totalitarianism, the systematic dehumanization of millions. These events gave Kafka's work a new and terrible relevance. He had written about arbitrary arrest, about guilt without crime, about bureaucracies that processed human beings like paperwork. He had imagined, decades before it happened, the nightmare that Europe would actually live through. After the war, readers returned to the trial and the castle with new eyes. They recognized something prophetic in the pages, something that spoke directly to what they had witnessed and survived. Kafka had not predicted the Holocaust in any literal sense. He had captured something deeper, the logic of dehumanization, the architecture of systems that crush individuals while maintaining the appearance of procedure and order. His reputation grew. Translations appeared in English, French, Spanish, dozens of other languages. The academic establishment took notice. Dissertations were written. Conferences were held. The thin, dark-eyed man who had died unknown in a Viennese sanatorium became one of the most studied authors of the 20th century. And a new word entered the language, Kafkisk. Everyone knows what it means, even those who have never read a word Kafka wrote. A situation that is Kafkisk is one of nightmarish complexity, of bureaucratic absurdity, of being trapped in systems that make no sense yet cannot be escaped. The word has become shorthand for a certain kind of modern experience, the feeling of powerlessness before institutions that seem designed to frustrate and defeat. Franz Kafka gave his name to a condition he did not invent but merely described. The condition existed before him and will exist long after his books have crumbled to dust. He found the words for it, though. He made the invisible visible. This is his legacy, not just the novels and stories, but a way of seeing, a lens through which the absurdities of modern life come into focus, a vocabulary for experiences that previously had no name. We return now to where we began. November 1919, Prague. A thin man finishes a letter to his father, 103 pages, 36 years of grievance, explanation, accusation. He seals the envelope. He takes it to his mother. He asks her to deliver it. She does not. Why? We have asked this question throughout our story, and we still have no definitive answer. Perhaps she was protecting her husband from pain. Perhaps she was protecting her son from retaliation. Perhaps she read enough of the letter to understand that some words once spoken cannot be taken back. Perhaps she simply could not bear to be the messenger of such terrible truth. The letter returned to France. He kept it among his papers. It traveled with him through his remaining years, through sanatoriums and love affairs and the slow progress of his disease. After his death, it passed to Max Brod, and Brod, who had already preserved so much against France's wishes, preserved this too. The letter was published. The private accusation became public document. The verdict that Hermann Kafka never received was delivered instead to millions of strangers across decades and continents. Hermann himself died in 1931, 7 years after his son. He never read the letter. He never knew how France had seen him, what France had suffered, how completely France had blamed him for everything wrong in his life. Would it have mattered if he had known? Would there have been reconciliation, understanding, forgiveness? Or would there have been only anger, denial, the hardening of positions already fixed? We cannot know. The conversation never happened. The letter went undelivered. Father and son lived in the same city, ate at the same table for years after it was written. They never discussed what France had written. The words hung between them, unspoken and unspeakable. This is how families work sometimes. The most important things go unsaid. The deepest wounds are never acknowledged. People live side by side for decades, carrying grievances they cannot express, harboring resentments they cannot release. Franz Kafka made literature from this silence. He transformed his particular suffering into universal art. The father who judged without explaining became the court that condemns without charging. The authority that could not be pleased became the castle that could not be reached. The guilt that existed before any crime became the condition of modern existence. He wrote about his own life, and in doing so, he wrote about everyone's life. Consider what we have learned in the course of this narrative. We have learned of a childhood marked by fear and humiliation, of a father whose own wounds made him wound his son. We have learned of a young man who could not connect, who pursued women he did not truly want to catch, who sabotaged every chance at ordinary happiness. We have learned of a writer who worked through the night, who found his voice in exhaustion and solitude, who produced masterpieces he believed were failures. We have learned of illness embraced almost as relief, of years spent in sanatoriums waiting for death. We have learned of one brief period of happiness, with a young woman who asked nothing from him but his presence. We have learned of a death that was slow and painful, and in its final hours, perhaps hastened by a friend's mercy. And we have learned of the aftermath, the manuscripts preserved against their author's wishes, the long journey from obscurity to fame, the transformation of a name into an adjective. What does it all mean? Perhaps the wrong question to ask about Franz Kafka. He built his art on the impossibility of meaning, on the absence of answers, on questions that lead only to more questions. To reduce his life to a lesson or a moral would be to betray everything he wrote. Yet certain observations seem inescapable. The first is this: damage perpetuates itself. Hermann Kafka was damaged by his brutal childhood, and he passed that damage to his son. Franz was damaged by his father's cruelty, and he passed that damage to the women who loved him. The chain of suffering extends backward and forward, each generation wounded by the one before, each generation wounding the one after. Franz saw this clearly. He understood that he was both victim and perpetrator, that the same forces that crippled him also made him capable of crippling others. His self-awareness did not save him from the pattern. Knowing why he hurt people did not stop him from hurting them. The second observation is this: art can emerge from the darkest places. Franz Kafka's writing came directly from his suffering, from the father who despised him, from the women he could not love, from the body that was slowly killing him. The pain was real. The damage was real. And from that reality came work that has outlasted everything that caused it. This is not an argument that suffering is good, or that artists need to be miserable. It is simply an acknowledgement that Franz Kafka made something lasting from his particular misery. The alternative, that he suffer and produce nothing, would have been worse. At least this way, the pain was not entirely wasted. The third observation is this: we cannot control what happens after we die. Franz Kafka asked for his manuscripts to be burned. His friend refused. Franz wanted to be forgotten. The world refused. He had strong preferences about his legacy, and every single one of those preferences was overridden. This should be humbling. We make our plans, express our wishes, try to control what we cannot see, and then we die and others do as they please. The dead have no power. The living inherit everything. Was Broad right to betray his friend? The question has no objective answer. From the perspective of literature, of culture, of the millions who have found meaning in Kafka's work, the betrayal was justified. From the perspective of respecting the wishes of the dead, of honoring promises made to friends, it was not. Both things can be true. The betrayal can be wrong and its results can be valuable. We can benefit from something that should not have happened. This is uncomfortable. We prefer clean moral categories, clear distinctions between right and wrong. Franz Kafka's legacy offers no such comfort. It is built on a foundation of violated trust, and we are all complicit in the violation every time we open one of his books. Perhaps this is appropriate. His work is about the impossibility of innocence, about guilt that precedes action, about complicity that cannot be escaped. We read him, and in reading him, we participate in the betrayal that made reading possible. It is, one might say, Kafkaesque. The apartment on Old Town Square no longer exists. The building where Franz Kafka was born was demolished long ago. A plaque marks the location. Tourists photograph it and move on. Prague has made him an industry. There are Kafka walking tours, Kafka museums, Kafka cafes. His face appears on t-shirts and coffee mugs, those enormous dark eyes staring out from souvenirs. He has become a brand, a commodity, an attraction. He would have hated this. He hated being photographed when he was alive. He asked for his work to be destroyed. He wanted to disappear. Instead, his image is everywhere, his name is on everything. His privacy has been violated 1,000,000 times over. The irony is cruel. The man who wrote about being trapped in systems that dehumanize has himself been processed by the machinery of tourism and commerce. He has become a product, packaged and sold, his suffering converted into entertainment. Yet beneath the souvenirs and the walking tours, beneath the academic conferences and the literary theories, beneath the translations into dozens of languages, beneath all of it, the work remains. The trial still unsettles readers a century after it was written. The metamorphosis still disturbs. The castle still frustrates with its refusal to resolve. The power of the rioting has not diminished. The questions it raises have not been answered. Franz Kafka wanted to disappear. Instead, he became permanent. His wish for oblivion produced its opposite, a fame that shows no sign of fading, an influence that extends into every corner of contemporary culture. He lost every battle of his life. He could not please his father. He could not marry. He could not finish his novels. He could not even succeed in being destroyed. And in losing, he won. In failing, he achieved. In disappearing, he became eternal. There is a final image worth holding. June 1924. A sanatorium outside Vienna. A man lies in bed, unable to speak, unable to swallow, able only to scribble notes on slips of paper. His body is failing. His lungs are destroyed. His throat is ravaged. He has asked for death. He has written the words, "Kill me or else you are a murderer." But before the end, before the morphine dose that will ease his passage, he does one more thing. He corrects the proofs of his final story. Josephine the Singer, or The Mouse Folk. A tale about a performer who loses her voice, about an artist whose art may be indistinguishable from ordinary noise, about the gap between what we believe about ourselves and what is actually true. He cannot speak, but he can still write. He can still edit. He can still care about getting the words right. This is who Franz Kafka was. A man who, even in his final hours, even in agony, even knowing that he had asked for all his work to be destroyed, still wanted the sentences to be perfect, still cared about the craft, still believed, despite everything, that the words mattered. They did matter, they still do. He died on June 3, 1924. He was 40 years old. He had published a handful of stories. He had asked to be forgotten. A century later, his books are translated into every major language. His name is known on every continent. His vision has become the lens through which we see our modern world. Franz Kafka wanted to disappear. He never will. And somewhere, if there is a somewhere, if consciousness persists in any form beyond the body's death, if the universe has any sense of humor at all, he is laughing. Laughing at the absurdity of it all. Laughing at the joke that his life became, laughing at us, his readers, who keep coming back to his unfinished novels and his unanswered questions. Laughing, perhaps, because laughter is the only sane response to a world that makes no sense. He gave us the words for that world. He gave us Kafkisk. We have been living in his imagination ever since.